But the top story of this segment is the odd incident yesterday in El Cajon in which state troopers helped a motorist whose Prius was speeding at 90 miles an hour to escape. The initial assumption was that this was yet another nightmare for Toyota at the worst possible time as it tries to deal with the recalls of millions of vehicles for concerns about acceleration problems. Today, however, Channel 10 News is reporting that the motorist, James Sykes, was involved in a suspicious burglary claim earlier in his life when he was a merchant in the Atwater area. So who knows where the James Sykes case goes, but one way or the other, Toyota still has enormous problems. And I'm pleased to be joined by Congressman Darrell Issa, a Republican from Vista, who has been in the middle of congressional attempts to get Toyota to open up about its safety record. Congressman, welcome back to KOGO. Good to have you on.
Well, thanks for having me back on, Chris, and thanks for sort of putting in perspective that we need to look at the entire problem of NHTSA safety and certainly their failure for a number of years to look closely enough at Toyota, but not necessarily one incident that may be absolutely the worst example of Toyota's problems.
Now, there seems to be a kind of a difference of opinion if you read the analysis pieces that are being done of Toyota. Some are sympathetic and begin to hint at the fact that these problems are not as uncommon with other automakers as we may assume. Others, however, say that if you look at the documents, there's a clear portrait of a corporate attempt to minimize the crucial information going to regulators to prevent them from drawing adverse conclusions about the world's largest automaker. Where do you fall on this continuum? Do you think we're beginning to see overreach, or do you think that there's a cover-up going on?
Both. There's no question that Toyota for a long time had a disconnect, particularly between their U.S. arm, who saw these problems as something that could lead to massive lawsuits and recalls and so on, and wanted to get ahead of them sooner. And Japan, which as a global company was sort of going, well, we don't have these problems other places. That seems to be behind the Toyota company. Their own CEO came over from Japan, made it clear that he was implementing changes and empowering the U.S. division to stop or shut things down if they didn't have confidence in a particular model. But the other part of it, the fact that there is some piling on now with Toyota where there's the real problems, and it's huge. 5.4 million, probably rising to 8.4 million cars will be affected by some sort of an item that should have been addressed sooner. At the same time, the other auto companies every day have similar ones. The General Motors Cobalt just had a recall of a greater number of years for a substantially similar problem to the Corolla. So putting in perspective, still a good company, definitely a company that was given more credit for great product perhaps than they deserve because they did have some growing pains. And then last but not least, and I'd say this to the audience, this is a non-union company, and there's an awful lot of piling on here in Washington by those who look at GM, Ford, and Chrysler, two of which are so invested in by us, and they're sort of constantly beating on Toyota because they operate in the South, they're non-union, and that's been part of it. Our own Chairman Ed Towns, sent a letter in which he quoted Japanese dissidents. Well, we looked into it, and these dissidents were union organizers who described our second-tier southern non-union wage earners in Kentucky and so on as though they were some sort of second-fiddle assembly shop, and that somehow Kentucky factory couldn't assemble as well as Tokyo or Detroit. So put it in all perspective, big problem. Toyota has a lot of work to do. They have a lot of repairs to do, and they're going to have to prove that they've really gotten the message. Littler picture, it's politics as usual, and you have to discount a little bit of the over-the-top that's going on.
Now, one of the things that is an example of the unintended consequences that a lot of folks warned about when the United States assumed control of General Motors and Chrysler was that it would be compromised because on the one hand it's running these companies, on the other hand it's regulating their biggest rivals. I read a very interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal that suggested that this had the potential to open up a significant rupture between the White House, Congress, and the Japanese government because of the perception, whether or not it's fair or not, among the Japanese people, that this was just hardball to achieve economic aims for the U.S. controlled companies. And to me, this is a kind of a classic example of why we should never have gotten involved in the first place. Is it beginning to settle in with your Democratic colleagues, perhaps, that this wasn't the most brilliant thing in the world to do, to bail out GM and Chrysler, just because of this kind of unintended consequence?
Not at all. The fact that many of them see this as an opportunity to give an advantage to union American jobs. The other thing you've got to remember is that support for the American auto companies is regional. In the major areas, including Detroit and Pontiac and the surrounding areas around Michigan, my own birthplace in Ohio, these things are, how do we protect American jobs with American companies, et cetera? And it doesn't matter if Toyota has an operation in Detroit, they're still foreigners. By the time you get to Mississippi and Governor Haley Barbour or Democratic Governor of North Carolina, Perdue, they're calling us and saying, please be fair. This isn't fair to these companies. We're suppliers or we have factories in our district. So all politics is local. It's not only local, it's regional.
We're talking with Darrell Sykes. I'm sorry, not Darrell Sykes. We're talking with Darrell Issa. I'm mixing up my Toyota figures. Darrell Issa, Congressman from Vista. This is Top Story at AM 600 KOGO, San Diego's news and talk station. I'm Chris Reed of the Union Tribune. Now, Congressman, I hope it's okay if we bring up health care while we've got you on the line. Well,
if you didn't, I'd be shocked that anything could go on in the media that didn't include health care.
Well, I'm not sure what to make over the recent fusses that are going on in Congress. On the one hand, the odd controversy involving the New York congressman who's quitting allegedly because he was accused of groping his aide, and his broadsides at White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel are commanding the news. On the other hand, I'm seeing stories that suggest that Congressman Stupak, the conservative from the Midwest who worries about abortion, may be wavering in his opposition to a health care proposal that includes funding for abortion. So I'm not sure where to make of things. Where do you think things now stand?
Well, first of all, Bart Stupak is pro-life, but he's not a conservative by a long shot. And it doesn't surprise me that the pressure has to be incredibly intense on him, and he at least has to keep hope alive. What I see is an odd combination. Vast majorities of the House and the Senate are controlled by Democrats. Obviously, that leaves Republicans as minorities. However, when you go out into the American people, the vast majority oppose the health care proposals in their current form, and a minority support it. That's a disconnect to have the Democrats supporting what has clearly become a minority position, in many cases even with a huge amount of their own voters. And it seems like they've gotten all caught up in, well, we have to pass it or it will hurt us. Therefore, they're passing it now based on we got to pass it to not have a political bad thing, rather than, okay, let's redo it so it's popular with our base, union, minority, and so on. And that part of the discussion has disappeared, even as the president told us at our retreat a few weeks ago that he was willing to consider breaking this bill up into the parts that we did agree on, certainly dealing with pre-existing conditions, giving people an opportunity to have portability and interstate competition. That's where we stand. It's a tough situation because we're on the sidelines, Chris. I'm only a slightly closer observer some days than you are.
Now, Politico.com had an interesting piece today that said that Pelosi had faced more revolts in the past 2 weeks than perhaps her first year and a half as Speaker combined. Revolts from Democrats in the Ways and Means Committee over who would succeed scandal-scarred Charles Rangel, complaints from the Congressional Black Caucus, the Blue Dog Coalition, and also complaints from first and second-term members that she was putting them at risk of losing their re-election battles because of how hard she's going for health care instead of focusing on jobs and the economy. Now, you are with these folks in a different kind of context than the media is, and I have never been able to understand why so many of these people wouldn't break en masse from Pelosi rather than sacrifice a budding congressional career, because normally, we're accustomed to the cynical idea that politicians will do what it takes to stay on the job. Well, this seems a pretty existential threat to their career. What does it sound like when you talk to these people off the record who know they're jeopardized if they go along with this?
Well, having been on both sides, having been a freshman Republican in the majority, and now looking at these freshman Democrats in the majority, here's the way the pressure plays out, and it includes when Rahm Emanuel goes in a shower room and starts telling people they better vote or the president won't be in their district, or he'll be in the district talking against them. And that's wrong. He's a tough guy all the time. Here's what happens. If you're in a contested district, a swing district, and we don't have any in San Diego right now, but we used to. It used to be that Bill Bray's district, his old one, would be back and forth every couple of years. When you have that kind of a district, particularly after campaign finance reform, a member cannot raise enough money unless he has two things. One, leadership telling the PAC community and the donor community, give to this person, they need it. And two, the independent expenditures that in their case comes from the Democratic National Committee or the DCCC. If you do not do what the leadership wants, they can withhold both. So now, yes, you're a good, represent your district, independent kind of guy, but instead of having $2.5 million for your swing seat, you now have $500,000, and you're trying to convince people that the $2 million you didn't get makes you the person to get reelected. Well, in fairness, you've got a Democrat in the primary who may take you on, who'll have funding, and then you have a Republican who, it's our job to fund our people and try to win that seat. That's the pressure on them, even before you get into, various assignment and cushy opportunities that they can have. That's why ultimately most of them cave, is until you've been there a couple of years and you've got a base of your own and you can look at them and say, look, if you don't help me, that's what's going to be heard in my district loud and clear. I've got a standing, I've got my committees, and so on. If you went to Susan Davis today, she is a person, a congresswoman who would be very hard to threaten. She can vote as she sees fit. But when she was a freshman, I pretty much would have to tell you she could only be so independent or she would lose the support that it took to get through her freshman reelection.
Congressman, thank you so much for your patience in explaining all these things. I really appreciate it.
No problem. And hopefully we are going to see a good outcome that is free of that kind of pressure, but it's good for your listeners to know it's there.
Thanks again. That was Congressman Darrell Issa, Republican from Vista. I'm Chris Reed. This is Top Story on AM 600 KOGO, San Diego's news and talk station.